Hello out there. Welcome to another AutoCrit Live. I am Daniel. I am a story coach, instructor, YouTube presenter here at AutoCrit. I do a little bit of everything. And for those of you who are new to AutoCrit, AutoCrit is really the premier website resource for authors. We have our writer's desk, which is an online workspace for you to work on novels and run reports and plan. And we have a community, we have an academy, we have everything you need at your fingertips. And I see here we have people from all over. We have East Tennessee and Ontario. Some of you are cold. I can tell you, I'm here in Central Florida. So yeah, there's really no such thing as cold around here. We get like 2 days of winter and we're not there yet. So still quite warm. Oh, I wear very hats except one biking hat that's missing. It is, but it might make an appearance. I still got 1 week left for NaNoWriMo, so we'll see. Maybe it'll turn up at the very end. I just need to track down my son and see what he is up to. All right, so yes, we are in the middle of NaNoWriMo. 50,000 words within the month of November. Wow, right? So how is everybody doing with that? I'm curious. I'd like to hear the progress of all of the AutoCrit community out there. How have we been performing? I know there was somebody last week and they said that they were going to have to basically write like 40,000 words as of today. So I'm curious if that person is still on and if they've made any progress since then. Because yeah, that's quite a feat. But ultimately, the purpose of this challenge is to help you develop your writing habits. Don't feel bad if you're not quite getting to your 50,000 words. What you're learning about yourself is rewarding in of itself. You're learning about why it's difficult for you to get to those goals, and maybe you've learned about some of the obstacles that you place along the way, and now you can work on dealing with them, solving them, finding more writing time, finding out how to have a writing space, getting yourself into the mental headspace to do work on a regular basis. All of these things are very helpful things to learn. You hit 15,000 words, but you shelved your writing for now for mental health reasons. You love the story, but you're just not able to do it. That can happen, especially depending on what you're working on. And you do need to be careful about that. We like to write stories that have high amounts of conflict. Sometimes we're speaking from the heart. Sometimes we're speaking about a subject matter that is intense in nature. And yes, you do need to take care of yourself. Don't push yourself too hard on things like that, for sure. Too busy wrapping up the novel you started last year. Well, I mean, that still means you're continuing to work. That's great. One book, or can you add up all the random stuff? You can add up the random stuff. 50,000 words is just the amount of writing you're doing, right? So if you're adjusting things, if you're adding, at least that's how I look at it. I know some people, there's different rules of thumb. There's purists or whatever. The people do use it for different methods. I say if you're writing it that month and it's not like a shopping list or something, it counts, right? If it's dealt with, if it has to do with your writing hobby, or career. 35,000, nice. Good for you. Direction is your enemy. Do you mean a lack of direction, or your direction wants to direct you to watch more Netflix or something like that? You're behind, but you can reach 50,000 words. Nice. Way behind. I could only type one-handed for a week and a half because of injury, but I still consider it a success because you broke writer's block and made progress. Yeah, with an injury. Yeah, absolutely. There's a way to barrel through. I'm impressed. All right, so one thing we're talking about a lot this month is writing styles. We're discussing how different authors approach writing and looking at it a little bit under the hood and getting some inspiration from different writing styles. One thing I wanted to point out is that at the end of this month, You're going to have that 50,000 word manuscript. Maybe it's part of a larger one. You're going to have a whole clump of words. And so the next thing on your mind is probably going to be, what do I do with all of this? And so I can tell you that next month we are going to be focusing a lot about editing here on the AutoCrit YouTube channel and editing on autocrit.com as well. One thing we'll be doing is our self-editing workshop. I think some of the people on here have already taken this before. It's great. It's really a crash course, but it's a crash course, but it really helps you develop that editor brain, right? And everybody has it to some extent. I mean, that's that inner editor I often tell you to shut off when you're doing NaNoWriMo, right? But what the workshop does is it really lets you hone in on that, right? And develop it into something constructive, not just that voice that's telling you that everything is terrible all the time. You'll start to learn maybe why you're not connecting with it and things like that. And also, it helps train you in systems so you can eventually stop editing, because the problem with self-editing is you can often have no clue as to when you are done. It's like great art is not finished, only abandoned, Leonardo da Vinci said, right? And so it's important for you to learn those skills so that you can essentially check off that list, and then whatever the work looks like on the other end, you know that it has gone through a process, and you can point to that process and you can feel proud of that process. When it comes to editors, there tends to be two different types of people. Some people are really snobby and they think they got everything under control and don't need to do much. And then there are the people that want to just hack it all to pieces. But ultimately, we need to find a balance. And so, yes, please join me for the self-editing workshop for that. And stay tuned to this channel. Like and subscribe. Hit the bell, because we'll be talking about editing within the AutoCrit YouTube channel as well. And specifically, one thing we'll bring up a lot is systems versus goals. What does that mean? Well, just stay tuned. Stay tuned. Little teaser for December there for you. All right. So I wanted to discuss author inspiration. This is what we've been discussing a lot in November with NaNoWriMo and all of that energy going through and, hitting the desk and cranking out the words every day. It's helpful to go back to the well and understand what it is that's driving us to write in the first place. It's also helpful to see the different ways that people can approach writing. There really is no correct answer, but there are some best practices, and it can be interesting to study what those look like. Everybody, of course, gets inspiration from somewhere. So don't feel bad about trying to get inspiration. The best thing is to be aware of your inspiration. Right? There's a very big difference between, just ripping off things and allowing works and things that you relate really well to influence you. Right? And then, especially if you're conscious about it, you might be deliberate in that influence. And then, what that will allow you to do is avoid just the pure ripoff. What you'll be doing is you'll be taking the tools, the mechanical structure, what's going on much deeper than that shallow level stuff. Because it's the shallow level stuff that when you start, ripping it off, not only is it not imaginative, but it also tends to not even work, because if all you do is, it's like taking the icing off of a cake. Well, you're not going to have a cake. You're just, you'll have a nice decorated pile of something, right? Take all that decorations off and just put it on the table. So you don't want to do that. But knowing the ingredients that go into a cake in order to make it rise, very helpful. And learning different ways that people went about it, also very helpful. And this is something to keep in mind when we are analyzing other works, when we're enjoying other works. You do want to ask yourself why. It does kind of take maybe some of the fun out of it, although they tell you as soon as you become a writer, you can't enjoy anything ever again, which obviously is an overstatement. But what they mean is you're either going to watch it and feel like, wow, that's really good. I don't know if I could ever do that, and I'm really impressed. Or you'll think, wow, this person's terrible and they're really popular. Life is super unfair. So you can end up in either of those camps. But what I'm trying to ask you to do is, when you watch something, ask yourself those questions. Why do you think it's working for you? Or even if you think it's popular and you don't understand why, I often like to ask myself that question, because it can be really easy to just be like, whatever, the general public is stupid. What do they know? But if the general public really is resonating with something, it might you may never be convinced you like it, right? I'm not saying that. I'm not saying you have to go with the flow, but what you might learn is what they're doing right. And so the things you hate about it, it's in spite of that they're still successful, right? And what you're trying to look for is that twist, or that mechanical underpinning that perhaps is connecting with the audience. You're behind and waffling because you're worried your villain hiding in plain sight is not working. That's a challenging thing to pull off. So I guess the idea is that you have this character and they're evil, but you're not necessarily supposed to know they're evil, but yet it's like kind of there in front of your face. The challenging thing as an author when you have a situation like that is, of course, you know everything. And you always will second guess yourself as to whether or not it's too obvious or not obvious enough, right? Because you don't want to necessarily have somebody in the 11th hour be like, "Bwahaha, I'm evil," because that's not very fulfilling. On the other hand, you don't want it to be like, "Bwahaha, I'm evil," and everyone's like, "Yeah, like we kind of knew that forever ago, like pretty much when you first showed up." And it's like, it's no big twist at all. So yes, a twist like that can be very difficult to do. Secrets in general are very difficult to do in books. In fact, I might just have to do a stream on secrets. If you'd like a stream on secrets and how to pull off secrets from the audience, let me know in the comments, because that could be a lot of fun, because it is challenging to do for sure. All right, today I wanted to talk about romance. Romance is an interesting genre. And one of the things that makes it interesting is that romance, in the traditional term and like the most specific way it tends to get grouped, ends up being a genre that is quite restrictive. And it's one reason why it gets a lot of criticism from those who don't like to read it. People will get angry at it for being too derivative or cliche or things like that, right? But that's actually one of the reasons why it's popular. See, again, this kind of goes back to what I was saying about something that you don't resonate. You may want to ask yourself why it is that other people are resonating to it. And I honestly will make the case that one of the biggest reasons why romance is popular is because it's from people that are seeking a certain amount of comfort. They're looking for something that is pretty predictable on purpose. Now, that's not the same thing as saying that romance isn't creative or it's less artistic or anything like that. But there's a specific structure to it. It's kind of like how, in the realm of music, there's some music that's quite loose and it goes every which way. There's some music that follows a very strict meter, right? And so it has this regiment. And the nice thing about music like that is, well, if you learn it, you can just pick it right up. It's easy to flow, right? And there's something comfortable about that. And it's the same thing with romance. Now, that being said, that is a plot element of romance. The plot structure often is similar. What about other elements of romance and how it can be different as a genre or similar to other genres? Okay, so you have the typical formula of any story. You've seen this graph before if you've watched any of our streams in the past. But we have the protagonist, the main character, who's on a goal. They have something concrete, some sort of a desire or want, right? And then you have an antagonist, and they are the obstacle between the main character and what they want. And then you have the relationship character that tells the protagonist how to get past the obstacle, and the distraction character, which represents the wrong way of getting past the obstacle. So in romance, the interesting thing is that you can have some interesting configurations of characters. One thing that romance can lack is some sort of sinister villain. They do exist sometimes, but often the villain is not really the antagonist. Often the antagonist fairly often, the antagonist can be somebody who is actually well-meaning and just misunderstood. The whole hate to love trope is based on this, right? The main thing they're trying to get past, the antagonist, is actually the person they're going to form a relationship with by the end of the story. And then the distraction character is, maybe the other person in a love triangle, or somebody who's kind of bashing the antagonist, right? But ultimately, the main character is able to get what they want, which is the concrete goal is something like, they want to get married or something like that. And the antagonist, the person they think is the biggest obstacle to them and their happiness, actually ends up being the person who is key to their happiness. And this is one reason why, even though romance can be fairly straightforward in terms of its plot elements, it can be very interesting in terms of its character elements. One character that I think can really pay off well in romance is the relationship character. Because the relationship character, like I said, they're the character that explains to the main character what it is that they kind of need to do in life and kind of puts them in the right direction. And there's a lot of very entertaining relationship characters in romance. Sometimes they're just kind of the good friend, but sometimes you never know. They can be pretty wacky because they just have to be the person who gives them the wise piece of advice that helps them better themselves throughout the story. And then, of course, there are so many different things that can tear relationships apart, right? It could be some failing on the part of the main character. It can be a failing on the part of an antagonist. It can be a mix of things and external elements. It's really one of the biggest components of romance when you're writing it, is trying to figure that out. Why can't the people get together? And of course, the last thing you want to do is something really obvious, like they're just kind of being stupid. They're just not talking to each other. They just misunderstand each other. Yeah, that can work, but often what makes a better romance is when you go deeper than that and you come up with something much more interesting. And that gives you that wiggle room to have that creativity. Of course, you also have creativity in terms of who the specific characters are. Even the main character and the romantic interest can be all different sorts of people with all different sorts of backgrounds. Again, even though the plot does tend to form a fairly typical pattern that's usually quite predictable, it's not really to the detriment of the genre. In fact, like I said, I think it's really the feature of the genre and one reason why people really like it. Somebody was talking about music, right? It's like jazz or pop. Yeah, but even if you think about jazz, right? If you think about it, you could even say jazz, often you'll have a very standard sort of chord progression, right? And so that backbone is very similar, and then the riffs on top of it is where it gets interesting, right? So I feel the same kind of way with romance, right? There can be that steady rhythm, and so it gives you that comfort. You're like, the groove, you can follow along with the groove, but then you can riff on top of it. In a romance short story I wrote, the villain was an evil carnival demon and the love interest magical faulty memory. The actual romance was fairly straightforward. Exactly. I mean, that's often the way it works, is the romance is often fairly straightforward. All right, so we're going to take a look under the hood of some romance, because I wanted to look at romance through the years with the help of our writer's desk and our reporting here at Autocrit, because I want to see, this is something I wanted to see for myself, how has writing changed in the romance genre? And I'm going to make myself a little smaller here so I can make my screen a little bit bigger. Hold on. Moving myself off to the side. Whoa, a little bit too small here. Hold on. Sorry about that. Okay. I know, it's a little microscopic Danielle. Look at me. So cute. All right. So I am now comparing Jane Austen to our generic romance. Just what is the standard practice for the romance genre, which has quite a few different authors, for example, some people like Nicholas Sparks, Danielle Steele, etc. Now, you would expect Jane Austen would be very different from modern romance, even though plot structure wise there's a lot of similarities, and you of course would be correct. Look at how different they are, particularly in the realm of word choice and pacing. Now, repetition's not that different, so it's not really a vocabulary issue per se. It's more of pacing and the specific word choice we'll go into. But yeah, you can see obviously the paragraphs in a Jane Austen novel paced a whole lot slower than a modern novel would be. The average words are much higher. If you look at the paragraphs by word count, look at how many paragraphs are over 100 words. This is just not something you would find. That sort of distribution, if you watch some of the earlier weeks, you usually expect more of like a bell curve that starts big and then gets really small. But that's not the case. It's actually like a U. It's very interesting. A lot more words per sentence even. So it's not even just that the paragraphs are longer, every sentence is longer. Now, this is one reason why older works can sometimes be less accessible to modern readers, because longer sentences are in fact more difficult to read. It does take more brain power because you're having to hold more in your head at once before you complete a thought, right? And so this is something to keep in mind with your writing in general. I often like to ask the question, how much brain power do you want the audience when they're at that point in the story? And sometimes you deliberately want to increase the brain power, right? You deliberately want to hone in the audience. Maybe you're talking about something that's really critical that moment, and so you go longer. But you hold them there that long, and it'll generally start to fatigue them. So I'm going to drop down. The dialogue's not too different. Jane Austen does have less dialogue than modern romance does, which isn't exactly shocking, but it's not nearly the difference of the pacing. One thing that's interesting is Jane Austen doesn't tend to use adverbs in her dialogue tags, which is a little bit, you might think, a more modern tendency to avoid that, but there you go. All right, so when it gets to the specific words, one thing that you'll notice is quite different is, hold on here, is the sentence starters. If you look there, you can see you've got about double. Now, starting sentences with things like a conjunction or whatnot can, again, be a little bit fatiguing to the reader. It's a stylistic choice. Obviously, I can't bash Jane Austen. She's a classic writer, but it is something that would make it stand out in comparison to a work nowadays. It's not exactly surprising that in a story like Pride and Prejudice, which is what I have here, that encouragement is very high and that lust is very high. This is what you would expect in a lot of romance, right? Now, lust doesn't have to mean like, just completely sexualized. It can be a deep-rooted desire, right? It's also not surprising to see greed's pretty high in Pride and Prejudice because a lot of that story involves social ranks and whatnot. And of course, fear's never going to go completely away. As much as romance is a comfort genre, there is, of course, fear of relationships, fear of failure, fear of rejection. All of those things do come into play in romance, just like any other genre. There, of course, is conflict. There, of course, is stakes. And that's something that makes or break a romance, right? Is if you can get that right, if you can actually care about what's going on. Particularly because, like I said, the outcome is usually pretty well known, right? So it's along the way, if you're invested, that tends to make it work or not. All right, so let's compare what romance looks like in comparison to just fiction in general. I'm going to go back here at the comments here. Weren't novels paid by the word back then? Perhaps they were. I'm not entirely sure. Jane Austen made an equivalent of 67,456. Interesting. Very different era. I'm not sure if that was fair at all. Probably not. All right. So This is Beverly Jenkins, and I'm comparing one of her books against just general fiction. So the question is does modern romance vary a lot from just fiction in general? And not really. You can see not much at all. It is quite similar to modern fiction. And I think that makes a lot of sense if you just kind of go across the board as to what like a book looks like. When you think of the writing style, romance doesn't really stand out. But again, it kind of gets back to the comfort, right? You don't necessarily read romance expecting it to make a lot of bold, quirky decisions in terms of its writing style. You tend to think of it as kind of even keel. Let's sit back and curl up and read a good book. And I don't mean any of this to be insulting about it. There's a wonderful thing to that. We all love our comfort food and things to go back to. It can be a huge help to us in life, and also, there's a great deal of respect I have for people who work within the genre because of how specific the requirements are. It sometimes limiting the creativity is kind of shows you how creative people are. At least that's my opinion. All right, yeah. So this is like you can see, it's very standard. You can see the sentences by word count is quite a bit different than Jane Austen. It's that bell curve, which is what we would expect. One thing is that romance does tend to have more dialogue than the rest of general fiction. I would say that's the biggest difference. And that's not a shock because romance is, in fact, about interpersonal relationships, and that involves a lot of talking. So the fact that you see that's really the biggest difference between in general fiction. And not exactly a surprise. All right, so let's look at the difference between two modern romance authors. Let's look at the difference between Beverly Jenkins and Danielle Steele. How does that look? Well, let's take a look. Quite different. Danielle Steele kind of stands out. Why? Well, look at the pacing. Look at the word choice. There's a lot going on there. Let's go a little bit deeper and figure out where this is coming from. One thing is that Danielle Steele has slower paragraphs. That's interesting. Also tends to have a lot more words per paragraph. Also tends to have a lot more average words per sentence. So there's something about the way that she writes that, in a sense, is a little bit more old-fashioned. And perhaps that's maybe intentional. It might be the audience. There's something to be said about writing in a slower pace. Some people prefer that. If you write with those shorter sentences all the time, it can feel choppier. If you have, those shorter paragraphs, they can feel kind of yanked through the book. That's maybe not what they're looking for. Again, if it's comfort, depends on what the audience wants, and something to keep in mind. Dialogue. A lot less than Beverly Jenkins. In fact, a lot less than a normal general fiction, which is interesting. So she has a lot more description about what is going on, a lot more adverb tags, just quite different, quite a bit of an outlier. A lot more passive phrasing, etc. And I will say there are people that don't relate as much to her works. And it could be a lot of these reasons, right? So, if you find that you don't, it could be a lot of these reasons, at least from a mechanical standpoint. Now, when you look at the power words, you will notice fear is a lot higher. So apparently writes with a lot more tension. But you see lust and encouragement up there as well. Greed is pretty high as well. Not exactly a big surprise there. All right, so let's look. Let's look though, just to kind of compare. This is Danielle Steele against romance in general, and you can see the trend holds. It's not just a Beverly Jenkins versus Danielle Steele thing. It's just in general. So yeah, she writes with a very different pace than is typical for the genre. So this is something to keep in mind. If you're an AutoCrit Pro user and you want to go into the writer's desk and you feel like you write at that slower pace, you might want to compare yourself more to Danielle Steele, right? It's just something to keep in mind. And then finally, I have Robin Carr. who's not really romance, more women's fiction. But you can see at this point, the pacing goes quite different. And that's because Robin Carr writes more in the kind of the suspense sort of direction in terms of her writing. And so you can see the slow paced paragraphs, it's not even remotely close. Robin Carr is half. So it's again something to keep in mind when you're working within the genre. Uh, there are different methods of going about it. There are different ways that people tend to write it, and you might want to take a step back when you're reading something and look at these sort of details, because it's not just some of these character choices and plot choices that are having an effect on you. It's some of this, mechanical stuff going on behind the scenes, and that's very important to realize as well. All right, I'm going to see if I can catch up here with some of these comments. It's hard for me to read the comments on the screen at the same time. Mandatory happily ever after ending. That is correct. Romance is not romance unless it has that happily ever after or happily for now. Because if you don't, well, you're violating the contract that you make with the reader. The reader is expecting that ending. And so, again, it does limit you in a sense as an artist, because the audience knows how it's going to end up, at least in terms of the emotional state. So it makes things interesting in terms of how you can be creative. But it's actually one thing I really like about the genre, and I find it very interesting. Now, if you use romance as a subplot, does there still need to be in happily ever after? No, because romance as a subplot is just meaning that the character has some sort of romantic relationship with somebody. It could be that you're writing a tragedy, in which case there's a romantic interest and it works out terribly. But I will say, as soon as you introduce romantic elements, depending on the way you introduce it, it's almost like you're introducing that genre into your story. So you do need to be careful. It's just like, you kill off the young kid or the best friend, and people can really not like you as an artist because of the choices you're making. You do have to be careful with your romance subplots, because if they go sideways, sometimes you can really lose the audience, because that's just maybe they didn't sign up for it, especially if it's a subplot, right? If the main plot is like, I don't know, there's a treasure out there and they're trying to go catch the treasure. In the meantime, they form this sweet looking relationship with somebody, and then it goes like super sideways because it turns out they're a horrible person that betrays them. You might wonder, it's like, well, why did you pull me through that? Whoever wrote this story, that wasn't very nice. I was just writing a nice little adventure story, and I thought I had a nice little romance. It was kind of telling me more about the main character, and then now you're just beating them up. So you do have to be careful. To some degree, there can be that expectation even in a subplot. It really depends on the tone of the story and whatnot. You'll notice that a lot of romance subplots that go sideways, they'll be set up that way. So it'll be like, this isn't really the good person to have a relationship with. They're the distraction or something like that. Somebody early on says, don't go out with them. They're bad news or something. And then it turns out that they're right. And so you're not really rooting for it in the first place. Aren't slower paragraphs bad? Well, it depends. It depends on what you want to what you want to sound like. Is it bad in the modern context, as it more difficult to connect with an audience? You might find it more difficult to get published, etc., etc. Yes. It does minimize, it does lower those chances. I would not call it a best practice with the way that current trends are for writing to write slower paragraphs. Slower paragraphs do tend to drag. So there you go. We need more horror romance. I have too many writing projects. Someone on here get on that. More horror romance. Fair enough. The one thing about horror and romance, though, is you're really having a thread of interesting needle, because horror is about making you feel discomfort and horrified, but it's discomfort, it's fear, it's some of the worst things. It's really the opposite of what romance is trying to do. So how you make them come together without diminishing the other, it's a bit challenging. It's like fire and water, right? Which you can do. You can certainly play them up against each other in a fascinating way from the juxtaposition. But I would say usually what you'll find is it's horror that will end up with some romantic element, or romance with some sort of horror element, right? And so in a horror romance where the horror is the focus, the romance can either be something that goes horrifically bad. So it's not a traditional sort of romance. It's a romantic relationship that just feeds into the discomfort the audience feels, right? Or the stakes for the main character. Or on the flip side, if it's a romance with horror elements, the horror elements tend to exemplify and personify some of the worst fears of the main character, like their insecurity or societal issues or something like that. I have an old horror manuscript sitting around that you want to get back to someday. Those are always fun, those chunk novels, right? I always recommend that when somebody's working on something, don't delete much. Save almost everything. I know you don't want to be like a complete digital hoarder, but especially nowadays where everything's like a digital file and text files are so small, it's like just find yourself a little, I call it my parking lot, and just put it in the parking lot, and you never know, it can come back someday. I've pulled weird things from my parking lot before. Stuff that wasn't even that related, just because it was like, I need this. And I'm like, oh, wait, I did write that before. And then I can change it and make it work uh, in a different way. Interesting needles. Thank you. Go ahead and take it. Yes, it's an interesting needle to thread. You're writing a romance that's thwarted by separation, but the effort to rejoin is the story so far. So this is very much an environmental conflict, right, or external conflict on the main characters. That can work where, the romance, the actual relationship is not so much in jeopardy. It's more that the world doesn't want them to be together. However, I would say even in situations like that, I tend to find it works the best where the external influences will start to wear down the main characters and make them really wonder. It's kind of like, I guess the world's telling me something, right? Like nothing seems to work out. It's like you try to get to this new restaurant and it's like then the road is closed, then you get lost, and then your car has a flat tire, and then you're like, well, I don't know, maybe I just shouldn't go there, right? So I would feel like if there's a lot of things, obstacles standing in the way, it does tend to have a psychological influence on us. And there's always a reason not to end up with somebody. So I would say, even if the main factor why they're not together is because of the outside world, I think having internal conflict about whether or not the romance is the right thing to do still makes it much more earned on the other side when it pays off, right? Because I mean, I can think of a situation where perhaps they're betrothed at the beginning of the story, right? They're engaged or something, and so it's like, okay, well, they're well on their way of getting together, and then, but along the way, they're getting thwarted by the world, and then by the time they get to the end, it's like they still have to kind of recommit themselves to each other. I think that's a lot stronger than just external things that are just kind of, barriers, because I really want them to grow. Now, it could be that, and because the other thing too is, all right, so here's another way of looking at a situation like that. If you have a main character and there's these obstacles that are keeping them from being with the person they love, and they can't, and they're true obstacles, which means they can't get past them unless they change, well, then that means the person they end up at the end is a changed person. So then the question is, how did that affect the relationship, right? And it may not have to put the relationship completely in jeopardy, but it is interesting to think about. There are implications. I like it. All right. So, like I said, next month is going to be editing month. We do have the self editing workshop, which is currently available. You can find it at AutoCrit autocrit.com. For our AutoCrit Pro members, I'm going to give you a little bit of a heads up that the first Friday in December, we're going to be doing a Pitch It session. And for those of you on the outside who don't know what that is, Pitch It is when our AutoCrit members can come in and they can pitch something to me, and I basically play the role of agent or publisher or general public, and I try to first of all parse out how I think about the idea itself. Have they really thought it through? Some people use it as a way to just kind of throw concepts at a wall to see what people might be interested in. But then there's also the idea of you have this finished work, it's awesome, but you don't know how to really pitch it to somebody else. You don't know how to summarize it to somebody else. And so this is a chance for you to practice that. So we're going to be doing that for our AutoCrit Pro members the first week of December, or the 9th of December, excuse me. And then I'm sorry, no, it's going to be the 2nd December. I'm misspeaking. And then the 16th of December, we're going to do something about holidays, about making your own holiday. At any rate, go on to autocrit.com and you can check out the calendar on the right-hand side. Jim says he's gone through some of the random writing, and among that, he's at 11,000. Nice! See? You find that writing, Jim. You're going to make it. I believe in you. But that's a lot to do already then in 22 days. So good for you. Congratulations. More writing is better than less writing. Seems obvious. But, the more you work, the easier it gets and the better it gets. So I encourage you to keep that up. But anyway, if you want to see more videos, please like, subscribe, and hit the bell. On Friday, we will have a big party here on YouTube because we have just recently launched the new AutoCrit website. You saw some of it today in the writer's desk. And we're going to have a special Black Friday bonanza. So pay attention to that. It's going to be coming on Friday. So watch this space. In the meantime, I look forward to seeing you all around the AutoCrit community. Bye, everybody.